We're on the stage of the Young Vic in London, where you played Dubois in the great Tennessee Williams Streetcar Named Desire. It was a fantastic performance here, and then you took it to New York, and then it was filmed. Can you tell us why you were so attracted to that part for so long? You wanted to do it for so long. What attracted you? What got you?
I did a monologue, I think, to get into college. I think that's correct, when I was about 16. And I didn't realize which monologue it was until I had actually 30 years later started to work on it, and it was still in my mind. And from that moment, I realized that she was already even as a 16-year-old, I felt that she lived inside me somewhere. And I didn't actually even study the play beyond that monologue between then and 30 years later. I just knew that I had to play her. I had to do the whole thing, not just a monologue, but I had to do the whole thing. So whenever, for the rest of my life, whenever I do an interview and somebody would say, what play would you like to do? What character? The only thing I would ever say is Streetcar, until the point where I felt that I was starting to be old enough to play her, and then started to actively try and put the production together. I can't point to what it was specifically.
Isn't it curious? Can you usually, with other parts you take on?
I think in order to decide whether to say yes to something, something needs to move internally that goes, oh yeah, it's in there, or I get that. I don't know why, as a 16-year-old, a a deeply alcoholic, deeply troubled, tragic character was familiar to me. But then we get into metaphysics, I think.
Yeah. But it's interesting that you carried it for so long. There's one word you use several times about people you play, and I haven't heard it used before. I've talked to quite a lot of people. And you say you inhabit the character. So it's a wonderful, it's a correct word. And how did you come to inhabit Blanche? She seems a long way from you.
Yeah.
Well, they all are, so that's a silly remark. But how did you come to inhabit Blanche?
Well, I had the great fortune to work with Benedict Andrews, our director. And because of everything that's been said, written, because of the film, it seemed the right way to begin was to erase any thought in my mind about who or what she should be or how the production should be or whatever. So, starting on day one of production, handing myself over to Benedict. And we spent the first week, of a very short, you don't get much rehearsal time for sometimes you get 4 weeks. So to spend the first week properly doing a table read, digging into it, talking about every single last scene. I didn't know that's how he was going to approach it. Was like, it was the most extraordinary experience that I'd had. And it was because of him. And I think that particular process that he asks an actor to go through, that taught me how to absorb on a level that I don't think I've ever done before, a character based on text. So regardless of preconceptions, regardless of what I would hanging over, left over from the 16-year-old mind of who she was, but just purely based on the facts and the text, mixed with, one's own alchemic emotional response to, an internal identification. And that's really it. It's everything I learned during that. And I guess I'd learned it in study a little bit before, but it just became so clear because you could always find it. That's what's so amazing about Tennessee Williams, and I think particularly in this play, is there are so many layers, and you keep being surprised. And there are gifts everywhere you look. And so completely giving oneself to that process, I think she just started to come to the surface. She started to fill me up from the toes, you know.
Yeah, I mean, the complexity is, it was here you did it the first time in this. The complexity is surprising because you think, oh, it's about this woman who does that. But as you say, from digging in, she's layered and layered and layered. I don't know how he keeps pulling it out, Tennessee Williams, on 2 or 3 of his plays, not all of them. He just pulls it out, and then there's another layer, and then there's another layer. And the edginess of it all, I don't mean edginess, ageness. One moment she's there, and then she's there.
Yeah.
Although she seems to be on a direct course, she's also on an indirect course all the time, doesn't she?
Yeah, and also I think there's something about the magic realism that he imbues in his plays that on the one hand can seem whimsical and contrary. They actually help you to or almost to relax for a minute, so that and it sinks you deeper into the darker aspects of the production. I think I think he's one of the best playwrights out there. I really do.
It seems to what you've been saying, and from the other performances that you've done, it seems to defy the going notion of, oh, I find something in myself and I build on that. It seems to be contrary to that in this case.
In this case, yes. I think in other cases, maybe it's
fine.
Different, but in this case, yeah.
And that's because of the nature of Blanche.
I think it's the nature of Blanche, and also, you know, her particular tragedy, you know, from where she was born, how she was brought up, everything that transpired in her life, you know, is completely contrary to the person that she actually really wants to be and present herself as. And so if one of the things that I actually struggled with, and that Benedict had to keep reminding me about, was it's really easy to play the tragedy. And actually when the audience was most affected was when the things that are revealed about Blanche are such a surprise. It's such a knife-edge turning point where you get the sense that there's something going on underneath, but you don't really know. She's keeping everything light. She's just a very vivacious, buoyant, you know, slightly hysterical, but fun character. And it's not, but he kept saying, don't play. It is so easy to play that from the minute she walks in, she starts to circle, you know, her sister's house. And he's absolutely right. And that is the biggest tragedy, you know, is her grasping so hard onto the ideal of who she thinks she ought to be, should have been, and in grasping, just completely destroying her own self, eating herself alive from the inside out.
Trying to fight for survival, really, a lot of the time.
Yeah.
I mean, the end's unbearable, really. I mean, we were shaken by it. And you did, it was wonderful. I mean, the play was brilliantly directed. It was a very good cast and so on. But that end sequence, I've never seen it. I've rarely seen anything in the theatre as powerful as that, and as just shaking. The disintegration of her character, and the watching her going towards a sort of lunacy and ending up as they walk up there, as being taken to her room, really.
Yeah. It was hard not to get. It was quite a challenge to not succumb to that insanity in the practice of it, in the doing of it. You know, 7 days a week.
Must have been
or 8 shows a week. It took as much energy to not flip over to the other side, I think, as it did just to get, you know, she's an incredible, our particular production was so muscular and so, you know, it was very visceral, and for every cast member and for the audience, I think, and it was very raw, and so much of the the detritus of the events that take place ended up on the floor of the stage, and there was glass, and there were mashed potatoes and pork, and and gravy, and that we continued to walk through, and my clothes would, Blanche's clothes would sweep it up in the process and stain. It was incredibly raw, and so to get to those end scenes where she is being pushed to the very, very brink of sanity. And also you've got in the production there were voices echoing through the theatre. Blanche, it was really hard to hang on to reality. And
this very slow burn menace of Kowalski.
Yeah.
All the time, her sisters.
Yeah, mocking her and just cruel.
Wait, but the line at the end where it says, "This we've waited. This is I always knew this was going to happen at the very end." What was it like going home at night after doing that?
When we did it in London, it was by necessity. I'd still, I had kids at home, school run, et cetera, et cetera. So I just, even though in London I couldn't sleep, I could not sleep at all. And so I would listen to John Lair's book read as an audiobook in my headphones. And somehow that both helped me to feel, sorry, book on Tennessee Williams, that helped me to feel like I wasn't abandoning the show that I was doing during the day, but it was also calming me into some semblance of sleep. And so that was the only way that I could get sleep. So, I was exhausted by the end of it, but it was what it was. When we went to New York is such is such a big personality, and Blanche is such a big personality that it almost felt like the two couldn't coexist in the same place. And so I basically shut myself indoors. My kids were in school back here, so I couldn't. So I just basically was between my Airbnb and sometimes didn't feel like I could even walk into the shop to get the food that I would eat between shows. It was just too much information. So it's, so on the one hand, I would say, it was fine. It was fine, it was great. No, we didn't take her home at all. And, on the other hand, you can't not, in some way it was playing out subconsciously, whether it was in my sleep or playing out in my, my minimized activities when we were in New York. And in New York, I did, I got to a place where at first I thought that it was almost like I was having a spiritual experience playing her, because it was so, I was present in a way in her than I had ever been in the whole London production. And I don't know what caused it, but and at first it was like, oh my God, this is amazing. Is this what it's meant to be? Really kind of in awe of this somewhat spiritual experience, particularly during the speech about the young boy, about her old love. And then all of a sudden that wouldn't leave. And I was stuck in that place, even going home at night, and I started to get a little scared about. I talked to somebody who helped me to ground at different points during the play, so that, in safe points where it wouldn't be noticed by the audience, where I was digging into me playing a character rather than inhabiting Blanche, and ended up getting through it. But it was, I'll never forget that for the rest of my life, because it was an out-of-body experience.
Mm. And do you miss her?
I do sometimes. We were talking initially about doing a third run back here at the Young Vic. There was something extraordinary about doing it, and we all knew it from the beginning, doing it in a small space, particularly doing it in the round, and being able to be so close to the audience, and that they were in it with us. That it was unique and really an exceptional part of the whole of it. And we were talking about doing it again, and everybody was up for it. And I can't remember exactly why we didn't, but there was a point where I actually thought, I don't know if I'll make it, actually. Yeah. I think I just got to the finish line after the second one. I think if I dare one more.
I mean, those of us outside watching you and watching great actors take on these tours, you do wonder how you pull yourself together. I mean, how you say, I am not that, because the word inhabit keeps going back to my mind because it's such a good word, and I really hadn't encountered it before. It's the right word. And how you, especially cast it off when you know you've got to do it the next night.
Yeah.
Why do you want to cast it off when in 20 hours you're going to do it again?
Well, I remember talking to Bradley after Elephant Man. He had a traction machine because he had to hold his body in such a contorted way to play the Elephant Man. He had a traction machine in his hotel room that he would hang on for half an hour every night. And I kept thinking, that's actually not that much different from the contortions that one needs for Blanche. And it does affect you on so many different levels.
Yeah, I move on, but I'm just fascinated by, you said in interview that you weren't fragile, you weren't threatened, but you did find a basis of comparison, a basis of identification. And I wonder what that does to one's mind. It's an extraordinary thing, isn't it, that you do, I mean, do you feel you become someone else for that 3.5 hours?
Yeah, I do. Yeah.
Is there any way you can explain that?
Well, I guess it's similar in a way to any character that one takes on. Is, you know, we are only ourselves because of how we present ourselves to the outside world, I guess, and our personalities, how we formed our personalities, whether it's you know, just simply our voice or how we hold our face. But, you know, I could look as I do and have a completely different personality and way of carrying myself and way of dressing. And anybody could, you know, and you would think they were potentially somewhere else, and it's someone else. And it's kind of, it's kind of just doing that. You know, for Blanche, it almost felt like a chemical change, but in doing Thatcher, you know, recently, in sliding into her voice, her way of holding, you know, or my way of holding my face or my mouth or whatever as her, my head, the mannerisms and everything, it's, you know, I almost feel like sometimes I'm disappointed when I see on the outside that it's still me, because from the inside I feel like I look like you know, like that person, and feel like I've almost like transformed cellularly so that you would have the same experience. And then sometimes I look at the finished product and I think, oh, I've failed.
And it might be something to do with, the fact that we are multiple personalities inside our heads.
Yeah.
Put on a face to meet the faces that we meet.
Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, we all do it to a degree.
Yes. But then it's how much you run with it, how far you go with it, because there's only time or space to be one of those persons.
Yeah. I mean, completely, you know, Jeffrey Dahmer, I mean, did the smallest things, you know, grew sideburns, put a mole on his face, changed the way that his hair was and changed his voice a little bit. And policemen with wanted posters up around the world, policemen would talk to him. He was a different, you know, it's shape-shifting.
Yeah. You were born in Chicago. You came here to London when you were 2, went back to America, to Grand Rapids, when you were 11.
Yeah.
It's a good chunk, that 9 years. It's an important chunk, according to people like Freud. probably the most important chunk. So what do you feel looking back that you got out of, got out of London?
Well, for all intents and purposes, I felt like a British child. I mean, even though I kept being reminded by other people, by Brits, that my parents were Yanks, I had a fully formed British accent. I looked like a British child, had rosy cheeks and dressed like a British child in the 70s. And so, there was this other world, which was family in America. And every couple of years we would go and visit grandparents and cousins, and it seemed like, they were the Americans and I was the Brit. And I always stood out because of that. Everybody loves in America, everybody loves a kid with a British accent. And so I got a lot of attention for it. But I think, I was an only child until I was 13. And, both my parents were working very hard. We lived in a flat. They both went to school and had jobs. And it was quite a solitary childhood. And actually, I think it has greatly influenced me as an adult, because I like my solitude, and I'd be very, very happy to not see any other human beings for long periods of time and stay indoors. So that's, I do think a lot of that has to do with finding ways to entertain myself. So that's what I think of. When I think of my childhood in London, I think of playing alone in the back garden. I think of hedgerows. I think of blackberries, spider webs, and playgrounds, but always slightly on the outside because of the fact that my parents were American, and I was never really a part of any group or community.
So when you went back to America, when you went back to
Yes,
America when
yeah.
you were 11, was that a shock?
It was a shock. It was a shock, and yet it was, there was a lot of excitement around it, because all of a sudden my dad had a proper job, was being paid proper money. We lived in a condominium rather than a basement flat. The loo was inside. There was 2 loos rather than 1 loo, And so a lot of excitement. I mean, starting school in an American grade school, all of a sudden coming in as a Brit, at first, lots of attention, lots of curiosity, and then lots of enemies as I started to take advantage of all the attention and started to bribe people with gum and stuff like that. So it was mixed, both feeling excited, that I should be excited because everything was so much better on the outside, and at the same time, it felt incredibly foreign and different, and I felt quite out of place.
But you started to act a different person in a way, if I might put it that way.
Yeah.
From what I've read, if I was wrong, just check it out. But you became very punk. You became very disobedient.
Yeah.
Your people in your class voted you as the girl most likely to get arrested.
Yeah. I was arrested.
Other things, but that's the one that stuck with me.
Yeah.
So that was real. You were on the way towards delinquency.
Yeah, definitely.
Why was that?
Successfully. Not on the way. I actually succeeded in delinquency.
Gluing up the gauge at the school and that sort of thing.
No, but I don't know. I don't know how much of. We kept going back to London. So my parents still had a flat in London. So we go in the summertime. And who I was and how I was, I guess, in Grand Rapids, Michigan, was, it's an Amway town, Republican town. Then to go back to central London as I'm getting older and starting to see a part of London that I never actually saw before because I was too young to necessarily be exposed to it. And feeling like, actually, that feels more, there's something about that feels more like who I am and where I belong. I ended up bringing a part of that to Grand Rapids. I remember we went to Camden Market and I bought clothes that felt like they represented who I actually really was, rather than this innocent girl in Grand Rapids. And it kind of flowed from there. The boyfriends that I ended up having were, there was a lot of drugs, a lot of acting out, a lot of delinquency, punk bands and staying out all night and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. You, at 14, you went into therapy, and you seem to have benefited greatly from it. You talk about it, and you've been in therapy ever since.
Yeah, it was so helpful to me at the time to have someone to talk about stuff with in a way that, for whatever reason, I didn't feel comfortable addressing with my parents, and really believe that the help that I got through the years because of the early therapy helped me to get through every challenging stage of my life, of which there was quite a bit. Yeah.
The thing that struck out for me about all of that was that when you were in a community play when you were 16, then, as it were, that was the light turned on.
Yeah.
And there are two things about that, it seems to me. First of all, it was a community of people doing what you were doing, so you weren't alone anymore.
Yeah.
People did these things. And secondly, it was a play, and you're acting. So can you tell us a bit about that, how that came about, and how, according to what you've said before, a light turned on, you thought, well, you tell me.
Yeah. As much as anything, it was that I had an inkling that there was something that I could do. And I don't know, I'd never really been in a school where acting was a part of the curriculum or the study, but it was just something that I knew. I knew that was something that was potentially in me that I wanted to do. And so then when I actively moved towards it, which again, I can't remember what the impetus was at all, but when I did, and I experienced that on the stage for the first time, that there was a positive reaction to something that I was doing at a time when I was confused, troubled, not particularly happy. It was positive reinforcement. I felt like I had worth and value, and that it was something, this sounds cheesy, but it's true, something to live for, something to look forward to, something to move towards. And it seemed like other people were confirming that. And so that really was the beginning of, that was the beginning.
Were there any actors you saw as models, you saw as people, I would like to be like that?
Well, I remember, I've spoken quite a lot about having seen Out of Africa and being both struck by the strength of character of Karen Blixen, even though it's a controversial appeal, but also how extraordinary the transformation was in Meryl Streep. And I thought, I can do that. I can do that. And so that was really the main, I don't know whether there was anything else or anyone else. It just felt like, I just felt like I could do that.
And how did you set about doing it?
I listened to people. I had an internship at a theatre, and in asking advice of what people did, they said go to college. There are a few colleges you could go to that are acting conservatories, and for some reason I chose one rather than a few. Just assumed that I would get in. It was an audition process where they, where they break it down, and I don't know how many end up hundreds audition, and there were 20 at the time in the class, and that was the Goodman Theatre School, and that was it. I auditioned, I got in, I started college. That was what I was going to do.
And then the first part that drew you to the beginnings of public attention was in New York, off Broadway, Absent Friends, British play, and you got the outstanding newcomer in that. Brenda Middleton was in it.
Yeah.
That must have been fun.
It was fun. It was a bit of a whirlwind. Somebody else was cast in the role, a known actress, who then backed out after with only 2 weeks left of rehearsal. And so they were willing to take a risk on somebody who had never done off-Broadway before, had only done theatre college, but because I had a British accent, could do a British accent, they hired me. And that too, that was a big learning curve, because I was undisciplined. Lynn Meadows was the director, and she had to sit me down on a few occasions and talk to me about timing and entrances and all that kind of stuff that I just, didn't really know or understand the importance of it.
But she was good by the sound of it.
I guess. I don't know. I don't have much memory.
Well,
I do remember at one point emoting just a little too much during somebody else's emotive scene, getting my hands slapped for drawing the attention away. That was the last time I ever did that. But good lessons, hard lessons, really being caught up short in misbehaviour.
But the theatre was your North Star at that time. You weren't going to go into television. You weren't going to go to Los Angeles. You're going to stay in New York, possibly London, and go into the theatre.
Yeah. And then what happened?
And then what happened?
Well, I did, there was 1 year where I'd been waiting tables for what felt like an eon, and it was probably only about 6 months in New York, and no work, no anything, barely any auditions. And then on one day, I got 3 jobs. And so it was either to do the first production of Carol Churchill's Mad Forest off Broadway, which I slightly, every once in a while, wish that I had actually taken that. But the other course was that I could do another British play, The Philanthropist, at up in New Haven, Connecticut, the Long Wharf, and do an independent film. And the schedules of both of those could happen simultaneously. But because I was greedy, I chose the 2 rather than the 1, which took me up to the Long Wharf. And then I met a young man who played the philanthropist, and I ended up moving to Los Angeles to visit him and then selling my return ticket. So that's how that happened.
And then there's this business of getting into television, which you... At that time, it's worth saying, because television is now so powerful as a vehicle for drama and so good. Yeah. And so there always were good playwrights, but it seems so many of them now, tackling such powerful issues right across the board, especially in Britain and America, which are the only 2 places I know about. That time, people in the theatre here, but perhaps in your group too, thought, well, television was down there, and the thing was to be in the theatre, or maybe in the cinema, but television was down there.
Yeah. There was a real sense of selling out if you did television back then, and there was very little on that was of any real value in the way that we value productions today, Netflix and HBO, and so I'd sworn off doing television. If I did auditions, I was mostly doing auditions for film while I was in Los Angeles, and there's not much theatre auditions going on. And then, wasn't getting much work. And then somebody sent me, a TV pilot of the X-Files. And I'd done a tiny other television thing, an episode on something. But that was really the first thing. And during those auditions, going to network to try and be cast in a TV show, the other young ladies that were auditioning with me were young women that I had been auditioning with in New York for theatre. It was Jill Hennessy and Cynthia Nixon and, that lot, which then went on to not get the X-Files because I got it, but they had huge careers in television in their own right afterwards. So everybody in that world was coming in, flying in to live that life.
But you got the X-Files part, and there was some surprise. You knew that you'd got it.
Yeah.
Why were you surprised?
Well, I didn't know anything. I mean, I was so green. I didn't even know what pilot season was. I didn't know what repeats were. I didn't actually realize that the shows that I would maybe watch after high school, like Brady Bunch and Gilligan's Island and all that nonsense, that those are repeats. I don't think it didn't clock to me what the whole network system was. And so when, I remember when it was called back a couple times and then I was going to go to network, I had to ask all the questions. What do you mean network? What does that mean? What do I do? Who do everybody else who was there had been to network 100 times already, knew what the game was, knew what the racket was. And I went in just completely naive and, I came in wearing oversized, I borrowed somebody's suit to wear for Scully, and it was like 3 sizes too big for me. Yeah. I was told if I was going to come back for an audition that I needed to wear something more streamlined, was the word.
Did you?
I did, yes, I did. I certainly didn't go miniskirt, which I think is what they were after. But I definitely borrowed a different suit that fit.
But the writer was determined to keep you, wasn't he?
Yeah.
He had to fight.
Yeah.
And he won.
And he really fought. Yeah.
And maybe this is too insensitive, but what did he want that he saw in you and not all the others that were turning up?
Well, I think he knew what the network was after. What Fox had prior to that. I can't remember whether Baywatch was actually on Fox, but that was what was on telly. You didn't have an example of, an independent, strong female character on network television at the time. And that's who he had written. And he wasn't going to let the network turn that into something that was predictable and out of the character that he had created, predictable for television at the time. So, he saw something in my, dowdy, very focused, playing at intellectual version of Scully that was slightly awkward and slightly, just very, very nerdy and wordy. And, that's who he had created. He hadn't created a bombshell.
But you sort of puncture the premise of the thing again and again, your character. And that's fascinating. You do it for 200 episodes, no? You're the skeptic.
Over 200, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, certainly I think Scully became Chris Carter, the executive producer and creator, didn't intend for her to become a sex symbol. I didn't intend for her to become a sex symbol. I wasn't aiming for that. But there was something about the dynamic between the two of them, the sexual tension between the two of them, that created this this frisson that just drew people in and turned this, you know, sometimes down. I mean, I got pregnant a year after, so, you know, very dowdy, sometimes quite chunky. And, you know, the suits I was wearing were polyester pastels and puke colors and stuff like that. So through all of that, this fan base was starting who were both, you know, men falling for Scully, women falling for Scully, people wanting the two of us to get together and to fall in love and to, you know, all of that stuff started to happen around these two slightly, you know, very, very, very like uber intelligent characters who could answer any question that anybody asked on any planet in the world. And it all happened despite us. You know, we were just young actors just showing up and doing ridiculous hours and trying to memorize our lines every single night without losing our minds. And people just completely grabbed onto it.
So what was the magnetic factor about the plot itself, about the aliens, about this? What was that part of the interest?
Yeah, I mean, definitely I think that was part of the interest. I mean, I think people became interested in it who didn't think or know they were interested up until that point, you know, interested in life outside of Earth and science even. I think people were shocked by the character of Scully and seeing a woman represented in that way on television. And they were drawn to that new thing. And seeing themselves being represented, that it was, you know, that it was okay, it was cool to suddenly be booky and smart, and that you could be sexy and smart at the same time, and all that kind of stuff. And you know, Mulder, you know, Agent Mulder's one of the coolest characters that's ever existed on the page. Anyway, he's just, you know, he's this outcast that's stuck in the basement, you know, eating sunflower seeds that just is, you know, and so women were attracted to him, men wanted to be him. It was just this weird, and I think on the one hand, the science and the stories were almost not conjured, that they were so tertiary that I think they were tuning in for this duo. And because it initially started on a Friday night, it was the beginning of appointment television. People would stay home at night with their family. People would stay in on a Friday night to watch the show, and which had never really happened. People would gather in groups to watch it together. And because of the thrill element, the scary element, the horror element, it's, you know, that appealed to people. There was, you know, and then the politics at the time, you know, the fact that there was, you know, conspiracy theories and anti-government, and, you know, the audience was, it was just it was a perfect moment. 5 years later, you know, with Bush, don't know whether it would have taken in the same way.
Yeah. It took in a phenomenal way. Yeah. I mean, I think it was 9 years, wasn't it?
Yeah.
It's rather like an apprenticeship of some young boy in the Middle Ages going along to a theatre at the age of 12 or 13 and learning how to do that. And it taking him for 10 years just to do it. I mean, and not saying that you needed 10 years to learn how to do it.
No, but yeah.
From reflecting on what you've said about it, which I'll come back to in a second, it was like an apprenticeship, and it was grueling.
It was apprentices in front of the whole world.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Because I really, I mean, again, in the same way that I didn't know what, you know, pilot season was, I didn't know about finding my light or hitting my mark or anything. I didn't know what they meant about us getting picked up. If the pilot was picked up, what does that mean? What do you mean picked up for 13? Well, if there's 13, well, you know, everything was just kind of like, okay, just going along with the flow.
Yes. But the success was phenomenal.
Yeah.
And that brought its own pressures. One of the pressures was they wanted you to do more and more.
Yeah.
And can you give viewers some idea of what they demanded of you in terms of work?
Well, you know, there were sometimes 24 episodes, hour-long episodes per season. And that, by anybody's standard, is a lot. We shot each episode in 8 days. That is a short amount of time to shoot something that's, to shoot 24 seasons in a year, let alone something as ambitious, as cinematographic, with as much CGI, et cetera, as what the show was. It was mostly, at least at the start, a two-hander, which meant that every conversation was had by us, which meant that every line was us. And so the hours were, I say, 5.5 days a week, because you start at 5 a.m. on a Monday, but by the time, with the 12-hour turnarounds, you end up going home at sunrise on Saturday morning. So by the time you actually then get home, go to bed, wake up again, you've lost half your weekend, and then you start again at 5 o'clock on Monday morning. So, but that's just how it was, and we didn't know any different. I certainly didn't know any different. I just did what I was told, and so we shot for 9 months of the year, and then sometimes did press during the hiatuses in Australia, Europe, etc. And then went back again for another 9 months of the next year, and then another 9 months of the next year. And then I had a baby.
And you only missed one show?
I missed one show, yeah. The good news is that the episode that they wrote me back in post-pregnancy, I got to be horizontal, so I was in a bed. I got to lie down 10 days after my C-section, which I would have been doing anyway. So no big deal.
Yeah. Did you ever feel in those years that you'll be stuck with this character?
It never occurred to me. No. I don't think it occurred. I mean, I think for so long, it was, it was a #1 show for a while. And I was making the first check that I got was, my parents, it was like, I remember one day my dad had come home with a check because he got a check in order to make a down payment for a building that he was trying to make a business in. And that check was more money than my whole family. It was mom and dad and me at that point. It was more money than we'd ever seen. I think it was $25,000 on a check. And we sat around the kitchen table just with our mouths hanging open, looking at this check of $25,000. My first opening paycheck was half of that. So to me, $12,000 per episode, unbelievable, I didn't pay attention at that time to the fact that was, a small portion of what my co-star was making. It wasn't important to me. That was a lot of money. And so I could only be grateful. I could only be pleased that I was working, grateful for the financial stability, amazing series to be a part of. Didn't really even think about the, and I don't know whether I went into it like this and I came out of the womb like this, or whether the show made me this, but I'm a grafter. I show up, I do the work, I'm prepared, I lift the bags, I do this, I do what's necessary. And so they said, do it, and I did it.
I hope the pay between the two of you became rather more equalized as time went on.
It did.
Yeah.
Took a fight, but it did.
Yes. Can we talk about The Fall? This was written for you by Anne Cubbett, who also wrote Prime Suspect 2.
Well, it was written with me in mind.
With you in mind. Right.
It was written
with you in mind. That's better. That's the best way to put it.
Yeah.
And he wrote the character Stella Gibson.
Yeah.
Who, I think it's fair to say, without being silly about this, hadn't been seen on television before. maybe not in movies, but can you describe her in ways that made her appeal to you because of the difference, not only with the character you'd played, but with characters you'd watched and so on and so forth?
Well, I mean, in general, I'm not really a television watcher. So I wouldn't be able to compare Stella to what was turning out to be a kind of plethora of 40-something lead female characters that started to come to the forefront, whatever this was, 7 years ago. But what I did know is that of all of the scripts that I had looked at between deciding I would never do another series and deciding to do another series, I was so struck by Alan's writing and how spare it was, and yet how much I understood about who this woman was without getting anything specific necessarily from the page, but she was just imbued into every scene. And because I'd had so many conversations, both as an actor and as a producer, about how to do that as a writer, how does one actually make that happen? I was fascinated with the fact that here was an example of good writing. And part of what you got from the page without him telling us was this incredibly, I mean, it seems ridiculous. I mean, obviously enigmatic. You know, it's clear that Stella is dresses carefully. You know, that she cares about how she dresses. Somehow, I can't remember how that comes through, you know, through the script, but it's not for anybody but herself. And somehow that comes through the script. You don't get a sense that she is showing off, that she's dressing to appeal to the men in a purely male field. She is completely self-contained. She has, you know, incredibly strong opinions about things, particularly where women and the protection of women and abuse against women is concerned, but how she relays that information to the people around her, whether it's out of explaining to their ignorance or out of making a point for her own edification or for her stance, is so smart and clear and pointed, and I just felt like I haven't seen this before. I haven't seen her before. I haven't seen a woman be so unapologetic about who she is. And that also goes for her and her relation to people that she finds attractive. As a professional woman who is in charge of other professionals at the top of her field, some of the choices that she ends up making belie her responsibility and her seeming level-headedness when she goes for, you know, a young police officer and just stops the police car, gets out of the car because she's seen an attractive man, and tells her what hotel she's staying at.
And the room number.
And the room number. And all of a sudden, you get this sense of this person from that action that opens up this world of unknowables, and in a way that is never actually properly answered. We don't answer that. We don't know anything about her childhood. We don't know. There's so much that we don't know about her, and yet we can't help but be fascinated by everything that she does and how she handles every situation.
She also makes mistakes.
Yeah. And she also makes really bad decisions. Yeah. And she also lies. You know, it's extraordinary. You know, the fact that this woman finds it somewhere in herself to be able to purposefully tell a mistruth, given her status and given what she also believes about truth and integrity and morals and everything. She's very complex, and I hadn't seen such a complex woman character before, certainly not on television. And so, you know, when I met them, when I started to read it and was fascinated, when I then met with Alan and the producers, it felt like there was no question. I was going to, even though I'd sworn off television, as I had before, there was no question that I would do it, because she felt like she needed to be out there.
Yeah. She needed to be out there. Why was that?
I think because of the fact that she is as complex as she is, and she is not perfect. Somehow she gave permission both to myself and to other women that it was okay to be, you know, in the same way that Scully, strong, intelligent, sexy, unapologetic, entirely who they are, you know, entirely, you know, she's a very strong character, and she doesn't, that there's nothing that she does in her actions and her behavior that she apologizes for. And sometimes to her detriment. And yet there's something about her conviction and her complexity that somehow gave permission to be as complex, to be a complex woman.
You seem to be drawn, I mean, it's very evident in that, but in many of the parts too, drawing a great deal out of a little. I mean, the beginning of a conversation about this particular play, you said it was very spare, approvingly.
Yes.
So there's plenty of space for you.
Possibly, but spare. Here's what I meant by that, actually, is that very often American writers are urged by studios to put everything on the page. And sometimes as a reader of those scripts, you end up feeling like the audience is being treated as idiots, as if they can't figure things out for themselves. So if there's a look across the room, they have to explain what that look means in the directive, you know, because 10 years ago, he blah, 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 you know. So I was so used to reading way too much information, or where the characters weren't coming through the text. They were coming through the descriptives in between the text. And to actually have a writer who was able to write dialogue based on the whole of the character and all of their attributes, and be able to imbue that into how they talk, which is different than how this character talks because of their personality. I mean, you'd think, you know, easy peasy, it's not. You think, duh, because isn't that what writers are meant to do? But actually, the amount of scripts that I read where that's not the case, it's so when you come across something that you get all of that, you get all of that information, but through how they talk, the pauses, what they don't say as much as what they do say, what they choose not to, you know, so many times you're like, just say something, explain yourself. And the fact that they don't is as much information about them as if they explained everything from the beginning. And so it's just, and so that's what I meant by spare. It was just really refreshing to get all of that from the text without being treated like an idiot.
Yeah. It's impossible to listen to you talking like that without thinking of Beckett and Pinter, because Pinter's pauses were as famous as his lines, really.
Yeah.
And as significant.
Yeah. And Beckett, yes, absolutely.
and carried things through. I mean, they carried the action through
But also,
because nothing was said.
I went to college for 4 years studying, studying acting, studying text, studying Shakespeare, studying great writing. And so much of the stuff that I did early in my career, even though I had learned, go back to the text, go back to the text, go back to the text. Is there a period there? Is it a comma? Is it an ellipses? What, how, that's not what I was dealing with early in my career. And so what I then learned was you can't trust the text. You can't trust, all of the writers in the writing room, what they're trying to do is survive. They have to come out with so many stories and deliver it on a certain date and a certain time. And half the time, they kind of know what the texts are about. They know what the trajectory is sort of where these characters are going. If you actually ask some of them, they'd go, talk to that guy, and so you just did it. I actually learned instead to just show up with the dialogue, just show up the lines. You don't even have to know what you're saying. You don't even have to look up the words anymore. At the beginning, I used to look up every single word. Just look like you know what you're talking about. And that's not really what I had aspired to do as an actor when I started out. So to then, when the series ended that I did for so long, I knew that the next thing I wanted to do was to do theatre, because that is where I last was able to go back to the text and trust in the writing and know that if I got that there is, that so much attention is going to every last detail and breath. And that's the kind of thing that I feel challenged by, and ultimately that I want to do.
But The Fall is one of the pieces you're most proud of.
Yeah, it is. And as much in that, it felt very much like a collaboration at the beginning. Alan was very open. It had all been figured out already in his mind. So it wasn't about, saying maybe she could do this, maybe she, it was more that, we entered into this trust. I trusted his talent. He trusted my talent, that I would know how to bring her to life. And that extended into the directing. We had a very green director with us. I've been doing television for 10 years already. We got to have conversations around that and the shooting of it, which I found very rewarding and felt like I was really part of the show. And it was also really nice to be with a small crew in Northern Ireland. It felt, I went from working for a studio where if I needed a flight back home to my kids or whatever, an email had to be sent, it had to be approved by 15 different people, and then maybe or maybe not, a few days before I was meant to fly, I'd get an answer, to texting the travel woman who was in a trailer somewhere in Belfast and say, actually, can I move the flight that I need to take off to the last day on Friday because I've got to pick up my kids, blah, blah, blah. And I just thought, that's kind of the world that I feel that I want to live in right now. It's much simpler, much more focused on the work, everybody's craft, and less of a machine, less bureaucracy.
And you'd move back to London, and one of the reasons, as I understand it, was that you said, it isn't quite as true now as it was when you did it, that the thing that you admired about the actresses and actors in London is they moved easily, and they had by that time moved easily between television and film and theatre. Yeah. And it was the theatre to which you address yourself with astonishing success, plays.
Well, I think, even at the end of my time doing that almost decade of television, we hadn't quite gotten into, you know, Netflix hadn't started yet. We hadn't quite gotten into the era where A-list actors would lower themselves enough to do telly. And, you know, all through growing up in the UK and when we'd come back in the summertime, it was just, you know, seeing Judi Dench on telly, seeing Judi Dench in the theatre, seeing Judi Dench in a film. It was the same with it was the same with all of them. Yeah. That it's just they're actors. They are actors, and they act in all the mediums, and there's acceptance of them being able to. They're not lowering themselves or you know, selling out in any way or giving up somehow by doing theatre. That is actually a celebration. That's not giving up because you're not doing film. That is choosing to express yourself in another medium because it fulfills you, or because you know, you want to take a pause for whatever, you know, it's all accepted.
And also picking up completely almost contrary parts. I mean, I was bowled over by your interpretation of Lady Deadlock. Was that a part you couldn't resist?
Well, it was so much of what that was I'd come to London to do theatre, to do a play after doing the series. And after having done the play, pretty soon after that, the first people that kind of came my way were the producers with Bleak House. And I remember meeting them in Notting Hill at the Electric, I think we met. And I remember asking them, what makes you think that I can do this? I've just done sci-fi for 10 years. And, you know, nobody in the States was offering me that kind of stuff. Nobody would imagine that I'd be able to do anything other than something quite, you know, similar to what Scully was. So the fact that they were inviting me, going to pay me to do a classic, something completely left field from Scully, I was very curious with why they thought that I could, because I knew I could, but it almost made me emotional that they believed that I could too. And because that's the kind of stuff that I'd always wanted to do. You know, I grew up with Merchant Ivory, and you know, we always held up Merchant Ivory as this, you know, beacon of quality and romance, and you know, and so yeah, it felt like, and I remember too being on the set as Lady Deadlock, and it was the first time in a decade that I was doing something that I felt, it almost felt like I was holding this, you know, this treasure, this bird, this crystal in my hand, and had a duty to do right by it, to take care of it, and it was the first time that I, on set, would sit and say stuff out loud while the lighting's going, but just feeling exposing myself, my mistakes, my trying to figure it out in this environment where it felt safe to, it just suddenly felt safe to do that it was, you know, that's what we were here for, that I remember that moment of actually sitting as on set and for the first time working it through and to get it right, and that I valued it that much. I valued the opportunity that much that that I gave my entire self over to it. And I think from that moment, I thought, this is it. This is what I want to be doing. This is the kind of stuff I want to be. I need to be vigilant about what I say yes to.
There's one scene which can't last much more than 3 or 4 minutes, where you go to telling your daughter she's your daughter and then telling her you will never see her again after this encounter. And you go through 360 degrees, and so does she, of emotion. It's quite extraordinary. It's quite extraordinary.
She's a wonderful Anna Maxwell Martin.
Pardon?
She's such a wonderful actress, Anna Maxwell Martin.
Yeah. That must have taken a lot of winding up to play that
Well,
scene.
I'll tell you, that particular day we had to stop shooting because we were shooting it outside and there were too many airplanes and too many bumblebees. And we would do take after take after take and go through that whole trajectory of feeling and then stop. And so we actually had to reshoot a good portion of it in studio to look like. So my memory of how it actually ended up, how they were able to kind of edit that together is a bit different than your experience of it, but they must have done a good job.
I remember you not being able to look at her, and you're there, and she's there, and everything's playing on your face, and she's just trying to take it all in,
Right.
which is almost impossible for her to take it all in. It's powerful stuff.
I must watch it again.
Yes, and then you were offered the part of Mrs. Thatcher, which must have taken a lot of thinking about. This is in the great series, The Crown.
Yeah. Thinking about in terms of deciding to do it, or in terms of the research.
Well, in terms of deciding to do it,
Except not really, because I mean, you don't get offered those things that often. I mean, extraordinary series, for one. An extraordinary woman, an extraordinary opportunity to do something incredibly difficult. And also, you know, my partner is Peter Morgan, who writes the series. I'd visited set since we had been together and seen how the production is run. And it's for telly, but it feels like the biggest film set you've ever been on. It just, you know, much has been made about the finances behind it, which is not entirely accurate. But I will say that it is a very well-run, very adult production. And, you know, the focus is extraordinary from every single department. And you really, as an actor, are, I could see, given a platform to be able to try and fail and be encouraged and protected, and you know, and so when Peter brought it up to me, you know, as one does as an actor, I do, you know, scanning whether that makes sense to me in terms of, do I think that, you know, I could do it? Does she live somewhere inside me? And you know, feeling quite strongly that I got her. It again felt like one of those things that one couldn't say no to, regardless of people's feelings about her, regardless of what reaction may or may not be based on either performance or how she's been represented in the series. Just an extraordinary opportunity on so many different levels. And so I was terrified.
Why were you terrified?
Well, it's the same thing with doing theatre. It's like I say yes before if I know something's right, I say yes before I think about it too much, because then I'll start to overthink it and I'll probably say no. So it always happens where at some point along the way I go, what was I thinking? What makes me think that I can do? Am I mad? And, you know, it's kind of similar with this in, you know, I started really early on the research. I started really early on all aspects of it. And as we got closer and closer and closer and closer, and, you know, I worked with a couple different people on voice, and then realized that I didn't quite have it and I needed somebody else or something else. And, you know, and so a lot of overthinking, a lot of not necessarily anxiety, but just, you know, really not wanting to get it wrong. You know, not aside from not wanting to make a fool of myself, but also
Was the voice where you started?
well, the voice is where I started simultaneous to, you know, reading books, you know, about her childhood and listening to her audio tape and reading Charles Moore and et cetera, et cetera. But yes, it's probably, but yes, because we were still doing fittings for potential wardrobe. I couldn't go there yet. We hadn't got a wig yet. We couldn't do it, you know, add all the other aspects of what makes Margaret Thatcher Margaret Thatcher. But yes, it started on the voice very early, but didn't reveal the voice until quite late, because, I mean, even though I was working with somebody, I don't know, I think partly fear, partly, even when we started to do the rehearsals or read-throughs and stuff like that, she would kind of show up here and there, and, you know, people would pat you on the back and blah, blah, blah. But when it actually came time to getting closer and closer to the doing it, it really took a kick up the rear to, you know, I think Peter said, "Where is she? When is she coming out?" I think he was absolutely right, because I just wasn't quite, I didn't feel like, I don't know, I didn't feel like the environment was quite, not safe enough, but whatever I'd made up in my mind, it just wasn't, I wasn't ready, you know. And so, but amazing thing about the production that they do is that they, for the first couple weeks of introducing a character, they will do scenes that take place at the studio. So if you do need to come back at the end of the shoot or later on in the shoot to fix anything or reshoot things, some of my first scenes were cabinet scenes, which on the one hand, you think, good God, are you kidding me? Like, can I not just walk down the hall and, you know, get her walk right? But yes, it was one of the few cabinet scenes. But knowing that if it wasn't quite right, we could come back and it wouldn't be like, you know, doing the scenes that we did in Spain, for instance. You know,
They're excruciatingly powerful, and it seems to me real scenes about Mrs. Thatcher's time at Balmoral, for instance, where again and again she's spurned. Dennis, her husband, calls them snobs and all the rest of it. The royal family, this is.
Yeah.
Which one or two of them are, one or two of them aren't. But Mrs. Thatcher's reaction, now I'm obviously eliding this, is first of all tentative and then very strong. She's first of all, oh, I'm not behaving in the right way. I shouldn't have dressed for dinner now because they're not ready for dinner. I didn't bring any outdoor clothing. I should have had boots and all the rest of it. And all of that and all of that. and there's one, well, you say she shouldn't be here at all. She's at the Highland Games. These brawny Scots are throwing cabers and you come quite close to her and she said, "What am I doing here?"
Yeah.
But there's the scene where she takes on the Queen, and she does it with a poem that her father taught her. And she's looking away. The Queen's, and it's marvellous. It's very powerful, the way that these two women, she just sets her background, her authority, her, as it were, line against the Queen's understandable authority and line.
Yeah. I mean, that's Pete's writing. I mean, that's the writing on the show. It really, nothing is necessarily predictable in the way that you come at relationships with the characters.
Another thing is, despite what you said at the beginning, she does come up, she comes out well from those scenes. You think, she's having a fight and she's not doing badly here. It was a complicated feeling for myself, and I think it will be for a lot of people watching it.
No, I'm sure.
But there it was, and you thought that was probably what was happening. And this is the way she stood up to it. So did you feel you were taking on a very different sort of outside expectation?
Well,
outside the part that was written, or the idea of doing a part, that there was the whole political dimension to it that people watching it would carry with them as they were watching it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one thing that I realized after doing all the research that I had done was, of course, that when you are playing a prime minister for the Crown specifically, it, by its nature, has to be through the prism of the Crown. And so the experiences that Thatcher has, or the experience of politics in Britain at that particular time, are seen through the Queen's eyes and her perspective of Thatcher, her perspective of Thatcher's policies, of her actions, whether it's the Falkland War or whether it's with the IRA or whatever it ends up being. And so not only are we distilling Thatcher's life into, you know, the 11 years only that she is in office, but we're also distilling Thatcher into the 6 episodes that I shot of the 10 episodes of The Crown. And so therefore they can only be, you know, snippets of her in power, snippets of her experience, snippets of her relationship with the Queen, snippets of her as mother as much as her in office. And I think one of the things that Pete was most fascinated by was you know, the degree to which they are both similar. They're similar age by 6 months. They, you know, are very, very strong and willful characters, both heads of state at the same time, and both incredibly religious. And so, as mothers who are trying to do their day jobs, what are they as mothers? When we don't actually see that of them very, very much. And so, is that not the most interesting way into elements of these 2 women at this particular time in their lives? And so we do get to see some of the you know, the personal elements of who Thatcher is in a way that we may not have ever considered before. We get to see her vulnerabilities. You know, I was very lucky about the same time that I was doing research. This 6-part BBC documentary came out about Margaret Thatcher that similarly showed her behind the scenes in a way that I don't think the nation had seen before. Very, very well done doc. And there's an element of that in The Crown, in, you know, seeing the moments right before she's going out to out of the house to give her you know, to address the crowd right before she goes and discovers that she is made prime minister, right? You know, while she's with Dennis, before she walks out to make her famous St. Francis of Assisi speech in front of Number 10, you know, all of those before and after moments, after she has been kicked out after Howe's speech in Parliament, her reaction to that in her private quarters above Number 10. That's fascinating stuff.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And while we've been talking about what we've been talking about, you've written books, you've been in many other things we haven't referred to, and we haven't referred to. I can refer to them, but I think we've come, and then we come to the bombshell, the moment with sex education, bump like that, and takes off in a way that you mightn't have expected.
No.
And it's extra. It's very, very funny.
Yeah.
Yeah. And as I understand, when they sent you the script, you didn't exactly take to it for the first reading.
Yeah, I didn't. It felt, you know, and I've said this publicly before, and they're used to it, the writers. But I think, you know, I don't get offered comedies very much, and so I've been looking specifically for something for a long time, and it didn't quite feel like it was the one for me when I first read it, and it felt very, very broad and slightly on the nose. And so I said I passed. And then Pete read it, and basically said, you have to give it another read. You stick with it. It's the funniest thing that he's read in a long time. It's going to be such a hit. And then once I properly gave into it, I couldn't stop reading it. So very lucky in that regard that he,
But I've never seen a character like that. That's another thing. It's fresh.
Yeah.
It's now, and it addresses those young people.
Yeah.
And it's very funny, partly because it's very real, and partly because it's so fresh. It's like the news from out there, which has never been discussed or in cloakrooms or behind laboratories, suddenly centre stage, and she's just facing it. Oh, you've started to masturbate. I'm very pleased about it. Very pleased. Pity you did it in the car. And I was watching it once, that one with one of my children, my son. He just cracked up. I mean, and so so did I. It was so funny, partly because it released an energy that had been suppressed for so long.
Yeah.
People did not talk about all of that.
Yeah. And I don't consider myself a prude. I mean, I'm really not a prude. And when I was reading it and felt like it was too on the nose, that's precisely what I wasn't getting.
Yeah.
Is that the point of it is that it's on the nose and it's in your face. And it's basically creating a platform for all of these things to be talked about that we wouldn't in a million years have dreamed about, putting front and center before. And once I accepted that, I think once I got that, and also accepted that somebody can be, a celebrated professional therapist who also goes through her son's drawers and listens behind doors. Once I kept saying, but hang on a second, wait. She just wouldn't do that. And then, but that was the point. I really didn't get it at the beginning. But once I did, it's, that, again, a huge gift. So much fun to do.
It took off in a way.
Yeah.
As big as anything you've done almost, isn't it?
Yeah, I know. Yeah. I know. It's been a long time that I've been standing in my house and, somebody's come to fix something or whatever, and the, builder turns around in my bedroom or whatever and say, aren't you the lady on the, It's been a long time since I've had that. They don't do that so much for things like Bleak House and Great Expectations.
But it's nice when it happens, I presume. Yeah. Do you have any... Do you feel that you've filled in a jigsaw of things you wanted to do consciously and unconsciously, that it started with, I wanted to do it, whatever it was, and then I wanted to do that, and then I did that, and I learned it, and then... You feel that there are gaps in the jigsaw I would like to have done, I wish I'd done more of? Or this?
Well, I think the years that I was getting to do Streetcar, the same year that I was getting to film The Fall, I literally thought, if I die now, I'll be happy. I'll feel okay. I feel like I'm doing That said, I do feel that there's a whole area. I've been focused so much on telly, and I continue to be. I'm passionate about documentaries. I'm passionate about film, foreign film, obscure film. And I think film, TV does too, but there's something different. But I think film can actually transform people. It's, as much as anything, it's the experience of sitting down in a movie theatre. It's a relationship between the audience and the work. And I feel like film can change people's lives. And
well, I think television can too. I'm glad they're both there. Yes, and you're going across them. Well, that was very good. Thank you very much.
Thank you.